Welcome to Unit 5 of Topics in Governmental Financial Analysis, Expense and Expenditure Analysis. We're continuing in this unit to look at analysis of changes in financial position. Last week we started by looking at the revenue side of the equation, things that increase or improve financial position, and this week we're looking at things that decrease or reduce financial position, namely spending and the incurrence of costs. We'll start by looking in general at what expense and expenditure analysis is, spend a little time talking about expenses and expenditures and how they differ and aspects of them that make them particularly good for analyzing certain things versus others. We will talk about the major factors in how expenses and expenditures are analyzed and the analysis of the things that contribute to or determine spending, the drivers of spending. Excuse me. In particular, two things, the demand for service and the level of service provided, and on the other hand, the cost of the inputs that are required in order to provide services. And for a lot of governments, that is predominantly the costs of employing workers who are going to provide those services. We'll look at a couple of concepts related to spending and cost, including efficiency and self-sufficiency. Spend a little time talking about surpluses and deficits, as well as the value of budgetary information. We'll examine some financial performance measures, ratios that can be used to give you an overall sense of how a government performed financially in a given period. And then we'll wrap up by shifting from operating spending to capital spending and thinking a little bit about the implications of capital spending in and of itself and as it impacts operating spending. So why do we do expense and expenditure analysis? Well, we just talked last week about where a government gets its money from, and so the obvious flip side of that coin is, where does that money go? What does it spend it on? Why does it need to raise the money that it raises? And why does it spend that amount of money? Is it because these are the priorities that the government's constituents have communicated to it? We want you to spend on these things, or is there a particular need that has arisen that is driving that spending? Does it have something to do with the cost of employing service providers, or other important costs like supplies and rent and utilities? And looking at its priorities for spending, what it spends most on, has that changed over time, or has it been relatively consistent? And then as well, how much of a government spending does it choose on its own versus have mandated? I mean, mandates are a big issue in governments, and we won't get into this in any great detail here, but that's something that you want to consider, because if a government is thinking about reducing its costs as a part of stabilizing itself financially, there may be a significant portion of its spending that it has little or no control over, because the federal government or the state government has told it that it has to spend money on this issue. Education, for instance, if a government's responsible for elementary and secondary education, there may be a variety of laws and regulations that stipulate how those services are provided and how much is provided, like busing and meals and student-teacher ratios, things like that. So you're talking both about mandates for services as a whole, as well as mandates for how those services are provided. The question arises when you're looking at analyses of the spending side of the equation, about whether you ought to be looking at expenses or expenditures. And the most straightforward answer, although it doesn't really seem like much of an answer at all, is that it really depends upon what you care about and what you're looking at. If what you're trying to get a sense of is how much things cost, how much services cost to provide, then I think you want to look at expenses, because that's going to be much closer to a true measure of the full cost of service, if there is such a thing. Expenses certainly will be closer to that than expenditures are, because expenditures aren't going to include all of the accruals. It's going to be much closer to what flowed out in terms of cash, and we'll have some accruals on the margins in addition to that. On the other hand, expenses are going to include certain costs that might not be important to you if you're looking at short-term flows of resources, such as depreciation. There's going to be a significant expense for a lot of governments for depreciation, but there's no cash flow that's associated with that. And so if what you're looking at is short-term resource flows, expenditures may be better for your purposes than expenses are. Likewise, expenses don't include certain things that may be important. The biggest of them is the repayment of debt principal. Expenses are going to show interest cost, but they're not going to show the repayment of debt principal, because that's a reduction of an outstanding liability. Whereas if you're looking in the governmental funds, where they use modified accrual and focus on the flows of current financial resources, you're going to see both the interest payment and the repayment of debt principal. And that's important, because looking at debt service, which is interest and principal together, as a percentage of total spending, or as a percentage of the budget, or a percentage of revenue, is a very key indicator of the affordability of a government's debt load. So in that case, you might want to look at expenditures rather than expenses. And then lastly, expenditures include capital expenditures, not just operating, meaning, purchasing equipment and, building infrastructure and constructing roads and buildings and such. And that may or may not be relevant to what you're looking at. If you're just focused on the sufficiency of operating revenues for operating costs, then capital expenditures you don't want in there. On the other hand, if you're looking at more broadly at the flows of resources through the governmental funds, capital expenditures are an important part of that, and you'll want to know whether things that are sources of financing that are strictly capital financing are fully supporting those capital expenditures, or if they're drawing off resources that might otherwise be used for operating purposes. So as you can see, I didn't necessarily answer the question for you fully, but I think, as in a lot of cases, the best thing to do is to conduct both analyses and see what each of them says, and try to understand why they're different, because that may tell you something very valuable about what's going on with the government's finances. Starting the analysis of expenses and expenditures, as always, we're going to begin with common size analysis, percentage distribution, and percentage change. Here's a particular local government, and these are its expenses for the most recent year. You divide them by total expenses, it's funny, and now I'm looking at this and I noticed that something funny happened with the Excel. I guess when I copied the cells, instead of copying all of them, 105,063,714, it added 1 to each of them, so that you're at 723 by the time you get to the bottom. Numbers that small aren't going to make a big deal here, but I apologize for that. That's obviously an error. Here are your percentages. Not surprisingly, for a lot of local governments that have a police force, police is a large percentage of their spending. Fire as well. Public works. Those are things that tend to consume a lot of a local government's spending. Interest on long-term debt here is really high. I That's over 14% of their total expenses is interest alone. That's very, very high. If you see total debt service, interest plus principal repayment that high, you probably have a concern about the affordability of their debt load. But if just the interest is that high, you want to look into that. Maybe it's a 1 year blip. Maybe there was something, maybe a refunding of outstanding debt or something like that that led to an unusually high single year number. Maybe the usual number is much lower than that. But if you look at the previous years and you see it's been in that neighborhood for a while, that's something that might give you cause for concern. Right, looking at percentage changes then, remember current year minus the earlier year divided by the earlier year. Overall, total expenses grew by 1/3 over that period. That's probably low. Maybe not for the last 10 years because there's been a lot of belt tightening over the last 4 or 5 years. But generally, if you look at a 10-year period, I think you expect to see spending grow faster than that, at least on a nominal or year-to-year basis without adjusting for inflation. So, your initial red flag analysis here is you look at the total spending change and then look at, amounts that are outliers or far away from that. General government has grown significantly faster. That's something I'd want to go look at. Why has it grown so fast? Now, granted, it's not an enormous part of the budget here. It's about a little more than 5%, and in the most recent year, it's somewhere in the neighborhood, I'd say about 9%. So, it's still less than 1/10 in the most recent year, yet it's grown very quickly. And you may have reason to believe that it will continue to grow quickly. And so you'll want to look at that trend. You want to see if it's been even over time. Particularly, this current year might just be a 1 year blip. Maybe, in fact, in all these intervening years, it's been between 4 and 5 million a year, and just there was some one-time thing that happened in the current year. So you'll want to check that. But what you may also find instead is that, in fact, it's been growing steadily over that period, and it really is up around this amount. Fire spending has been faster. Refuse spending a little bit faster. On the interest on long-term debt, we were just talking about, that's considerably faster. But again, that might be one of those issues that maybe interest, has been 8, 9, 10 million, and there's a blip in this current year. But still, it started off at 8 million out of less than 80 million, which means it's over 10% of the expenses, just interest alone, in the initial year. So it's not out of the question that it's up in the 14 to 15% range now. On the opposite end of the spectrum, redevelopment spending, other public works spending, has been growing slower than overall spending, and parks and recreation and library spending has actually declined over the 10-year period. That's not unusual either. Those are, areas that tend to get squeezed in a lot of governments when they have to make a choice between police and fire spending or repaying debt, which they don't have any choice over. Things that seem like luxuries to some people, like parks and recreation and libraries, tend to get stiffed. On the other hand, they tend not to spend very much relative to the total budget. This particular government that has parks and recreation, that's almost 10% of the current expenses, is rather high. To give you an example, I think in New York City, that has so many parks, just an extraordinary number of parks, including the each borough with one gigantic park like Central Park or Prospect Park or Flushing Meadows Corona Park. Every borough has one. Yet, I think last I looked, parks and recreation spending was something like 0.7% of the total budget for the city of New York. So we've taken a quick look then, that red flag analysis, to see where things are overall and how they've changed over time. And now let's start to dig a little deeper and understand why why the priorities are what they are. and why spending has changed in the way it has over time. For most governmental entities, particularly general purpose governments, the cost of employing people to provide service is the overwhelming majority of their cost. It's a little different for some very large governments that have large non-labor spending items. So, for instance, the states have aid to localities, education aid that they provide, um, you know, income transfers, Medicaid spending. None of those things are personnel driven. They're all other than personnel spending, and so their labor costs will still be probably the largest piece, half or more, but there'll be a significant portion that isn't related to labor at all. But for your typical run-of-the-mill general purpose government, a city, a county, a village, a town, school districts to be certain, the cost of employing the government's employees, is the biggest piece of the pie. Um, and there are two things that essentially drive that: how many people you employ, and what it costs to employ them in terms of salary, health insurance, other benefits, and then the costs of providing for pension and retiree health insurance, or as it's known, other post-employment benefits, or OPEB. Of course, the amount of service that is provided is a significant factor in determining the aggregate amount that is spent on any particular activity. It's certainly going to drive, in a lot of cases, the number of people that you employ to provide that service. And then there are a variety of things that drive spending that have nothing to do with personnel: rent, utilities, supplies, each of which has both a quantity factor and a cost per unit factor. Uh, Interest on debt is a big driver that's not related to labor, and of course depreciation as well, both in and of itself as an indicator of the cost of using capital assets to provide services, but also indirectly as an indicator of the need for capital spending and possibly additional borrowing, and therefore additional borrowing financing costs. If you look in the statistical section of the CAFR, there are three schedules that are known as operating information schedules. One of them shows employment for a government over the past 10 years. And since the number of persons employed is a significant factor, you'll want to look at this and compare it to what's happening with spending. You can see that overall, the number of people employed by this government, the city government, increased by 15%. And so you want to look at the things that vary from that. Uniformed police actually declined for this government, whereas civilians increased. So it looks like they've got something going on here, maybe where they're filling certain positions with civilians that don't require a uniformed officer. That's always a big thing in analyzing police departments. Is they tend to believe that there's no job that a uniformed police officer can't do. And that may very well be true, but there are many jobs in a police department that a uniformed police officer is way overqualified to do. For instance, mopping the floor. And it may sound funny, but I remember there was this story that came out in like the Daily News or something like that in New York about a police officer in the Central Park precinct, Central Park South precinct, I think it was, who one of the things he did every day was mop the floor. Clearly, an expensive police officer, a uniformed police officer, is probably not the right person to be doing that job. You could probably hire a civilian for a lot less to mop the floors in that precinct. Fire civilians and uniformed firefighters both increased faster. Sanitation collection, other public works, redevelopment all grew faster. On the other hand, Not surprisingly, since spending went down, the number of employees in parks and recreation and libraries went down as well. Now, you remember we saw that gigantic increase in general government spending. It's not matched by the number of employees. So it's not just solely driven by an increase in the number of employees, which grew almost 26%, whereas I think the increase in spending was like 117%. So that's part of the story, but there's obviously something unrelated to the number of employees. Maybe it's how much they're being paid. Perhaps it's non-labor spending. Maybe utilities have gone up or something like that. And here's a comparison. You show them side by side. The percentage changes for this period in expenses and the percentage change for the number of employees. Here's that difference I was just talking about. The number of uniformed police officers has gone down, but spending overall in the police department has grown by 31%. Pace of spending's grown faster here, so maybe part of the explanation here is that salaries and benefits, particularly like retirement costs, are going up faster and magnifying the increase in overall spending. And here you see that actually the decrease in the number of employees has been much greater than the overall decrease in spending. So you might want to try and understand what happened here. Why didn't spending go down as fast as the reduction in headcount? Maybe one of the things that's happening here is that they privatized some of the parks and recreation activities. So instead of providing it with public employees, a portion of what they saved from reducing headcount went to contracting with companies to provide some of those services, maybe like refreshment stands in parks, or the maintenance of some of the parks grounds or something like that. As we said, another key driver of spending is the level of activity, how much service they're providing. And the second of those three operating schedules in the statistical section is operating indicators. These are going to be levels of demand for service or levels of service provided to give you a sense of how much they're doing. And in each case, they may or may not have a percentage change column, but you know how to do percentage changes and you can calculate them on your own. One of the interesting things I think here is what's going on in the sanitation department. Under refuse collection, there's been a shift here from collection of regular garbage toward more recycling, a considerable increase in recycling, as well as an overall increase in how much garbage they're collecting. In this first year, it's about 243 tons per day collected, and in the most recent year, it's about 278. So there's been an overall increase in trash collection with a shift toward doing more recycling than traditional collection and dumping. So let's compare these percentage changes we just looked at to give us a sense of what might be going on. It's not going to answer it fully. You're going to need to pursue it a little further, look into the narrative that governments are providing in their CAFRs and in other documents like budget documents, maybe newspaper coverage or something like that. Look at the websites of the departments of the government to get an answer. Here are your percentage changes in expenses, the percentage changes in employees that we just compared, and now here's the percentage changes in some of those activity figures. And I think what's interesting, among these is that looks like some of the activity of the police department has grown despite the fact that the number of police officers is down a little bit. Not as fast as the spending, but the level of activity is only a part of the equation here. You're also looking at the number of employees, and the thing that we haven't looked at here, which you're often not going to find information about in the CAFR, is compensation, how much they're being paid. You will find some information about, a lot of good information about the cost of retirement benefits, and we'll talk about that in a few units from now. We'll look more detailed at the information on pensions and OPEB. But in general, you're not going to see salary figures, so you're going to need to look someplace else to get a sense of what's going on there. there's been a decrease in this activity here despite a significant increase in employment in the fire department. I think this might be building inspections. And so you might want to know, well, why are they, they've got more people working there, but they're not doing as many building inspections, which is a pretty important job when it comes to fire, because it's a part of fire prevention. And any successful fire service is one that prevents the fires before they start, not just the ones that put the fires out quickly once they have started. Down here in Parks and Recreation, they spent less, they have fewer employees, and yet they seem to be, at least by these two measures, accomplishing more. Remember, these are just a handful of measures. They may not be fully indicative of what that department does. The general guideline here is they ought to be picking things that are most relevant to the service, but it's not as firm a requirement as you might hope. And you also have the fact that this is supporting information. It's not even required supplementary information. Governments are only presenting it if they prepare a CAFR. There are a handful of governments relatively that provide a statistical section without doing a full CAFR. But other than looking to ascertain whether there's an agreement between these numbers and what appears in the rest of the financial report, the auditor's not even providing the certain limited procedures that are applied to RSI. Efficiency. So now we're starting to touch on that, because we're looking at these changes in the level of activity that are at variance with the change in spending and the change in the number of employees. That suggests that there's a change in the level of efficiency, which essentially is a comparison of inputs with outputs. Inputs like spending, inputs like number of staff, with outputs, the number of tons of garbage collected or the number of people arrested. We're going to get into this a lot more in Unit 14 when we talk about performance measurement, service performance measurement, that is, as opposed to financial performance measurement, which we'll talk about later in this unit. But I think we can at least talk about it a little bit. We're going to look at two basic types of efficiency measures: cost per unit, or spending divided by the amount of service, and staffing ratios, the number of employees divided by the amount of service. You could flip those around and put the amount of service in the numerator rather than the denominator, but I find it makes more sense with the amount of service in the denominator. So here's one example. Let's look at cost per ton of refuse collected. So spending in the numerator and level of service provided in the denominator. You have the expenses divided by the tons collected, and you end up with $84 per ton to collect refuse. Is that good? Is that bad? Well, how do you know? You can do two things. One, you can compare it to governments providing similar services, although you have to be really careful when you do that. You got to make sure that they're actually doing the same thing. Because if one government, for instance, is doing recycling and the other one isn't, then those numbers are not going to be comparable, because recycling tends to be a lot more expensive than regular refuse collection. The other thing you can do is look at that one government over time, but again, you need to be careful, because maybe you're looking at a 10-year period, but the government didn't start doing recycling until year 5. And so the latter years aren't directly comparable with the earlier years, but at least you understand why. You understand that they started to do recycling, and that changed the unit cost of the service they provide. So look at the number for the first year and the 10-year trend, and expenses divided by tons collected, and you see that it was less expensive, at least on a nominal basis, without adjusting for inflation. If you adjusted for inflation for this 10-year period, it probably got cheaper on an inflation-adjusted basis, because we're talking about growth of something in the range of 20% or so, just eyeballing it. But it went up, and so here's something you might want to investigate. Tell me a little bit more about why cost per ton is greater now than it was 10 years ago. Looking at the other type of efficiency measure, staffing compared with level of service provided. So we pick inspections per firefighter. Here are the number of inspections, the number of firefighters from the most recent year, and on average, each firefighter was doing 252 inspections per year. Yeah, that may seem like a lot, but understand that firefighters spend most of their day in the firehouse. They're not fighting fires all day long on the typical day, and so using them for other things like doing fire inspections, code inspections in buildings, maybe having them be first responders to medical emergencies, something that New York City has done, something that uses that downtime in the firehouse, may improve the efficiency of those workers. Now let's compare it again to what happened 10 years prior, and you see that the number of inspections per firefighter was much higher at the beginning of the period than it was at the end of the period. It went down from 350 inspections per firefighter to 252. So that looks like a reduction in efficiency. You might want to look at that and find out what's going on there. It may be a change of priorities, though. For instance, if they're now the first responders to medical emergencies, then they changed their priorities. They thought it was more important for them to respond to medical emergencies because the fire department tends to get to these things faster than the ambulance does, faster than emergency medical services. So it improves the the chances of recovery and survival for the person having the medical emergency. So it may be that they've shifted their priorities, or it may be that they're just not as efficient as they used to be. They're not providing as much service. We've been talking mostly about what's going on inside of the government, the relationship between inputs going into the process and the outputs coming out on the other side. But we also want to consider external factors that drive spending and help you to understand why a particular government spends the amounts it does on the things that it spends on. Economic indicators obviously are a very big part of this. For instance, employment and unemployment have a significant impact on service provision. And like so many things, they tend to have both positive and negative impacts. So it's not always straightforward that you say employment's gone up and that's a good thing. Because you'd think that if employment was going up, that means the economy's better, they're going to be generating more tax revenue. That's a good thing for the government, but it also tends to drive certain types of spending. So if employment's going up, there are more people in the city working, traveling to work every day. So your infrastructure needs and transportation needs may grow. Your sanitation needs may grow because businesses are more active and probably producing more refuse. On the other hand, if employment is dropping and the unemployment rate is growing, you probably have greater pressure for social services. There may be greater crime as people turn to crime to supplement their income. That's not unusual. It happens. There's a very clear correlation between unemployment levels and crime levels. Income is another important economic factor. Lower income suggests that there's more need for income support, daycare, publicly provided recreation like public pools and public recreation centers, because people are generally less able to afford those things on their own privately. Whereas as income rises, there tends to be a correlation with demand for things that might be seen as luxury items like cultural and arts events and environmental conservation spending. Looking at the demographics of the constituency of the government will give you an indication of what's going on in terms of service needs. A younger population obviously is going to drive elementary and secondary education spending, spending on daycare, maybe even spending on certain things like pre-K, which not every school district provides. Not every government that's responsible for education provides pre-K, but if they've got a really large, pre-K population, then providing that service, providing daycare, is important to allowing their parents to work. If you've, on the other hand, got an older population, then senior citizen spending, senior centers, Meals on Wheels, other things that are related to help for the aging. Certainly, health care costs are going up, and so if someone is older and uh, has lower income and is dependent upon government provided health care, that's going to drive health care spending up. The more dense the population is, the greater the need for public safety services like police and fire. Um, it also tends to drive, the infrastructure replacement needs because all of the infrastructure is being used more intensively. And the same is true for population growth in general. The higher the population in general, the greater the demand for services of all kinds. Climate. Obviously, government doesn't have any control over that, but it's a factor. If you're in the north, where you have freeze-thaw cycles, meaning things freeze and then it warms up and it thaws, and then it freezes and it thaws. That has a tremendous deleterious effect on roadways, for instance. So, in the north, you're much more likely to see potholes that need to be filled, in the roadways than you are if you're in the south where it's warm. Also, climate, if you're in the north and there's a lot of snow, then you're going to have snow removal costs, for the government. Generally, that gets factored into sanitation. That's one of the things sanitation departments often do is they strap some plows onto the front of garbage trucks and use those to plow the streets, or the public works department is doing them. What do citizens want? That's a very key factor. And does the government have any sense of what they want? Have they tried to find out? And is there, a relationship between what the government is spending money on and what citizens actually want? And are citizens willing to pay more taxes and, borrow more in order to have those services provided or to have that infrastructure maintained or improved? And then, there's a whole political aspect to this that's very qualitative and a little hard to get your hands around. You're certainly not going to get information about this for the most part in the CAFR. You're going to need to look at other documents of the government, at its website, at news coverage. What percentage of the government spending, does it choose to spend as opposed it's told to spend, it's mandated to spend? And this is sometimes the thing that's in the eye of the beholder. It's often in the interests of the government's officials to make that mandatory portion look as big as possible. Like, oh, my hands are tied. I don't have any choice but to do these other things, to cut these services or to raise these taxes because, big bad state government and big bad federal government is mandating me to spend on these other things. And if I had a choice, I wouldn't spend on them. But they tell me I have to. So you be careful when you look at those estimates, but you want to get a sense of, if you're looking at things like, social services, like in New York, for instance, unlike almost every other state in the country, with the exception of New Hampshire, in New York, the county governments pay for a significant portion of Medicaid and income support. Every other state in the country, except for New Hampshire, those costs are divided between the federal government and the state government, relatively 50-50. But in New York, the state government then takes its half and roughly divides it between itself and the county governments, which means New York City as well, because New York City is actually 5 county governments combined. And so, the New York City and those county governments have no choice but to spend that money. And it's very hard for them to reduce it. And Medicaid spending, health care for the poor happens to be one of those spending items that goes through the roof every year. You're also going to want to look at whether there are laws or regulations that require governments to provide service at a particular level or provide it in a particular way. Contracts, labor contracts are a big deal here. And New York City is another good example of this. New York City, in its labor contract with sanitation workers, for the longest time the contract said that there had to be 3 sanitation workers on every garbage truck. So you have one guy driving, you have one guy jumping off and grabbing the garbage can and dumping the garbage into the truck. What is that third guy doing? Either he's doing nothing, or he's also dumping the garbage in, and they're finishing their route much faster than they need to, and then sitting around for the rest of the day. It's a totally wasted resource, and so New York City negotiated a contract that reduced the number of required people on the garbage trucks from 3 to 2, shared some of the savings with the sanitation workers in the form of a shift bonus, and saved a significant amount of money. Years later, they found that with the advent of recycling and just improvements in efficiency and technology, most sanitation workers were finishing their shift in less than half a day, and so basically just sitting around for the rest of the day. And so they negotiated another change to the contract to change the routes, which, if you believe it or not, the routes were stipulated in the labor contract, which is just crazy. But it's those kinds of things that may drive spending in ways that if you had a clean slate and you wanted to decide how you were going to design that service, you'd never do it that way. Political parties of the decision makers can be an issue too, because there are some ideological factors that go into certain types of spending. Conservative or Republicans might be bigger on public safety spending, and Democrats might be bigger on spending for for factors like social services or education.